Hi, Kevin.
Yeah.
Hey. Hey, Kev.
We're doing this on Valentine's Day is a great illustration that we have no lives.
Hey, I don't know about you, but I have big plans. Okay, huge plans.
Okay, well,
in fact, I'm actually in the Caribbean right now. So I just want you to know that. So
Yeah, I know. Cheryl and Joshua are up college
right.
visiting up the coast of California. So I'm actually tonight. My night is a movie, video games, drink some beer.
Please
some
don't put that on the podcast.
gluten-free beer, and I'm just gonna chill.
Please don't mention video games on the podcast, please.
Okay. This won't be on the podcast.
Okay.
It'll be on the pre-podcast
No.
banter that I put
No,
on without
that
telling
counts.
you.
That's part of the podcast.
Okay, Kevin, we
just had to be very serious for a couple of episodes, so I'm feeling very contained right now, and it's kind of like the Pillsbury Doughboy when you open up that container, it just pops like all the stuff needs to come out. So this is just trying to get all my goofiness out. We weren't really allowed to do that on the last one, so we had to be very professional.
Well, let's get started. Melissa, is that okay, or did you want to chat some more?
Jeez, okay. I just wanted to say hi to Kevin, okay? No, I'm just kidding. But anyway, Dr. Bob's still eating his snacks, so
Okay,
I'm just going to give him like 20 more seconds so that he doesn't sound like, oh, ho, 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 ho.
Well, you can introduce us.
Okay, fine. I'm ready. Are you ready?
I'm
Everybody's ready. Okay.
When you open the door for somebody else.
Hello and welcome to the Vaccine Conversation with Melissa and Dr. Bob. I'm doing hand gestures when I'm introducing this because even though you guys can't see me, it's like I don't really think about the fact that you can't see me, so it's part of the thing. And one of these days we're going to be videoing this, so you can
that's
see.
why you want a video, so you can talk your hands.
The Italian hands.
I know,
They're
exactly.
Italian hands. And so we are here today with a special guest. I like our special guest episodes.
Mm-hmm.
Though we don't get to joke as much on special guest episodes usually.
But maybe we will this time because it's our friend. This is our.
We'll see. Okay, so I'm gonna introduce today Kevin Barry. So Kevin Barry is a former federal lawyer in the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York, and he is the president of FirstFreedoms.org, and he's also, fun fact, United Nations representative for an environmental literacy group. And Kevin, we've known him for a couple of years.
Yeah, several years. Yeah. He's almost a bigger deal than I am. It sounds like
there are a lot of people. There are a lot of people that I think would fall into that category.
What? Okay, name 5.
Elmo. Okay. Just kidding.
Luke Skywalker. Okay, yes, you're right. There's
and Kevin Barry.
Yes. Okay.
So welcome, Kevin. Say hi to everyone.
Well, hello, everyone, and I'm glad we got the joking in because we can do this the whole time, and it's really great to be with you.
Yeah, and Kevin's really funny
I think
too.
Bob is a very big deal and a very brave man, and
that's true.
#
#brave.
All right.
Stand with Sears, right? You are.
Yeah, I know. Right.
It's true. You are brave, and that's a good point. People don't realize, and I think it's pretty obvious because most people I know that believe in vaccine choice and believe in informed consent have their own healthcare practitioners. We're talking about medical doctors, DOs, NDs. All agree with this.
I know. Right.
This is not like they're just a handful. Quietly, they're not just a handful of doctors that agree. There are a handful of doctors that put their name on it. And so that's why people give you that credit for being brave, is because it's not that you're the only one that agrees with this and is trying to put that forth. You're the only one that's doing it on a public stage because everyone else is free to tell their patients this and know that they're doing that service and quietly support it. But unfortunately, with the climate the way that it is, people are afraid. We're talking about medical professionals who are afraid to admit what they know to be true and what they've seen in their own practices over decades of experience. They're afraid to just tell the truth. And isn't that so sad? So you are brave because you're putting your name and face on it because you're not afraid to tell the truth. And you, I think, encourage other medical practitioners to be even a little more vocal about it or to be more involved, even if it's on a smaller scale. And a lot of these doctors get together privately and are in connection together to create forward motion on this idea of informed consent and reducing risk. And so, people might think it's only a handful of people. It's not. It's not. It's just a handful that are.
I think you're right. There's many of us all over the country that feel this way. And so Kevin in New York, he's one of the people that are doing this. You're not a doctor, but you have obviously great credentials and a lot of experience with this. And so, Kevin, in your organization, it looks like you tend to focus on the religious freedom and political issues and kind of the freedom aspect of this, and try to raise awareness on why all Americans should be against medical mandates because these freedoms are really one of the foundations of our country. So, Kevin, why don't you just maybe give us a brief overview of what firstfreedoms.org is all about and what you do, and I don't know, just kind of give us a little rundown on that.
Sure, and what the way you run your practice, Bob, is the way I think most pediatricians in a perfect world is the way they would run them. But it tees up the religious question because it's a dogma. There's a dogma that comes from above, from faceless bureaucrats, from the AMA and from Institute of Medicine, that you have to do things one way, and if you're a heretic if you don't. And all of that type, that's all religion. That's belief. That's not science. It's not faith. So that you offer vaccinations to your patients who want them, and you don't force them on people who don't. And that would be the ideal. So again, yes, First Freedoms, like the inspiration for the name of the organization is the First Amendment. And there's 5 freedoms of the First Amendment: religion, speech, assembly, redress of grievances, and the press. And the first of those freedoms is freedom of religion. It's the after the Constitution passed and the founders are drafting the Bill of Rights, they're like, what else is important? And the first most important thing that they listed was freedom of religion, and it's freedom to freely practice religion. And the Establishment Clause that we won't have a state religion. So I think these vaccine mandates are coming. They're violating both of those aspects of the First Amendment.
Right.
And I think that's really dangerous. And I think for me right now at this moment, what's happening all over the country is where are the religious leaders? There's a religious freedom being taken away from millions of Americans, like what happened in California in 2015. They got 39 million Californians in 2015, they meaning the pharmaceutical lobby. And now I think it's up to 9 states where they're going after the religious exemption now, and it's more than 60 million Americans have a religious freedom at risk.
Because as it stands, we have 47 states, right? That currently have the religious exemption. Only 3 states do not.
Yeah, exactly. And if I could just maybe give a tiny little, maybe a bit of an overview of that issue. I mean, the topic of this podcast is discussing the religious exemption aspect of people's ability to opt out of vaccines and how that is being threatened in the religious and the political arena. And essentially, in case you didn't know, 47 states allow people to exercise their religious freedom and opt out of vaccines for those religious reasons. California, West Virginia, and Mississippi do not allow you to exercise that religious freedom, and that's very concerning. And as Kevin said, 6, 7, 8, or 9 states are currently at risk of losing this religious freedom this very year, and we'll get into later on how that's going to come about. But essentially, I pulled up some information from the NVIC. Basically, that just kind of goes over what a religious exemption from vaccines is, kind of what the intention is, and how people kind of go about using it. Is basically the exemption is intended for people who hold a sincere religious belief opposing vaccination, and they feel that being forced to vaccinate is an infringement on their constitutional right to exercise these religious beliefs. And if a state was going to take away those religious freedoms, the state would have to have a compelling state interest in order to do that. There'd have to be a really
public
strong
health crisis,
reason.
is what they say.
Exactly, a public health crisis. And they use the example of the Supreme Court decision in 1905 regarding the smallpox vaccine. The state felt the smallpox disease was such a big threat that trumped people's religious freedom to opt out of the vaccine. They basically say that this religious freedom is subject to reasonable regulation, that if someone was to exercise these religious beliefs and that would substantially threaten the welfare of society as a whole, then the state might take that religious freedom away. And in my opinion, the current state of infectious disease in the United States and in vaccination, there is no such threat. There is no such substantial threat that dramatically threatens the welfare of our society. Kevin, I'll maybe want your input on some of these things too. But basically, they say there are 4 types of religious exemptions across all the states, and these vary state to state. And so if you're going to use a religious exemption, you want to read the law in your state so that you can understand what the law exactly says, so you understand how your religious freedom is going to be protected. So basically, in some states, the exemptions definition might be broadly defined to include philosophical, personal, or conscientiously held beliefs that are sort of like religious in nature, but not necessarily tied to an organized religion. Then the second category is membership in an organized religion that has written tenets prohibiting vaccination. The third type is a signed affidavit from your pastor or your spiritual advisor from the church that you attend. And then fourth would be a notarized form with your signature on it that states you have sincerely held religious beliefs against vaccination. And so again, you want to look at what's going on in your state if you're going to exercise this and know how to do it correctly. Excuse me. And then they even suggest if you belong to a church, even that church has nothing to do with vaccination, they advise you to have a meeting with your pastor or your priest or whoever is the leader of the church, talk about your beliefs on vaccines and why you hold these on sort of on a religious level, and ask the pastor for a letter that simply acknowledges you had this discussion, because that might end up, helping you in the future. So that's kind of just the NVIC sort of brief guide to the issue of religious exemptions. I just wanted to kind of break that down in that systematic way, because I think it kind of it's a good introduction then to what we're going to talk about. Kevin, what are your thoughts on some of some of what I just said?
I think that's right, and I think in states where you have those options, meaning philosophical or religious, that's great, and do what you can to hold on to them. But it's not nuanced what the pharmaceutical lobby is trying to do. They're not slicing thin the 4 different types. They're removing the exemptions entirely. Mm-hmm. That's what's happening in New York. That's what's happening in New Jersey. And if we lose them now, like in California in 2015, we're not getting them back. They're not. Imagine going to the state capitol and trying to pass a bill that pharma doesn't like. That's not going to happen. So you got to fight. And then here's what I think. Like the philosophical, from my perspective, is the philosophical exemption is a little bit of a red herring. And the one thing the pharmaceutical companies do not want right now are religious leaders to get involved. And I think what happened in California, that the personal belief exemption that you had in 2015, that's it wasn't a direct attack on religion, so most religious leaders stayed home. And I think they got rocked to sleep. They had a freedom of their people taken away, and they didn't do anything about it.
Yeah, I mean, nobody talked about the religious exemption during that legislative battle. It was all about personal belief exemption. There was hardly any discussion about religious. And I think some people probably thought that didn't even exist anymore. All that was there was the PBE that needed to be signed by a doctor because of the 2 years prior.
Right, but I think Kevin's right. I'm shocked that the religious organizations are not up in arms with the fact that we are all going to lose a First Amendment right based on religion. Yeah, it seems like they don't care about it because it has to do with vaccines. They should care big time because it has to do with religion.
Right. They're afraid. They're, on principle, they should be doing exactly what we're talking about, but they're afraid of getting the anti-vaxxer label too. And I know this. I'm Catholic, so I've talked to people up to the bishop level, and everyone's like, "Oh, send in a letter. We'll send it along." But nobody wants to touch it. It's a hot potato.
Oh, there's so much pressure, too, for religious leaders to not be making a, quote, bad example and not be advocating for their believers to be down completely with the vaccine program. And this is what it always comes down to. It comes down to people worried that it's going to completely eliminate the vaccine program, and that what you're saying is, by the fact that you want to have a religious right to opt out of one or more doses, that you are saying they should scrap the whole program, not be available to anybody, and therefore all these diseases are going to come back. But having the right to opt out of a dose is not the same thing as thinking that nobody in the world should be vaccinated. And I think they use that extremism on purpose so that you have to fall into the it's okay to have mandates camp, because if they don't want you to have that middle ground, they want things to be very extreme. Either you believe in vaccines and therefore you're okay with mandates because public health, or you, if you're believing in choice, then that means you don't believe in vaccines, and then you get the label of anti-vaccine, and then you become a threat to public health. They really make it, you can only be in one of those two camps. There is no place to go in the middle. Even if you want to do, 65 doses and opt out of 4 doses, like you would be put into the other side. And so people are so afraid of that they will go ahead and allow these things and stay quiet, so that they don't get the negative label.
Yeah. So Kevin, start us off with maybe what you see as one of the primary religious reasons why someone would want to opt out of vaccines based on their religious beliefs.
Yeah, absolutely. But let me touch on something Melissa said because it's so significant.
Yeah, I usually don't find much of what she says to him, so I just kind of go past it. I know. I let her talk because it's the Melissa and Dr. Bob show. But anyway, okay, go ahead, Kevin.
But it's about to be a word that I have a hard time saying, but bear with me. Again, this is from a Catholic perspective, and everything we do at First Freedoms is multi-faith. But I'm most familiar with Catholic. I've been the altar boy, etc. But there's a Catholic doctrine called subsidiarity, right? And usually, the hierarchy is top down, right? It's very, Pope, Monsignor, bishops, whatever, cardinals. And subsidiarity is the
Kevin, can I interrupt you for a second? You're breaking up some. Is there?
Sorry.
I don't know if it's your end or our end. Our last call was very clear. Are you on like a earpiece or something, or I don't know what?
I'm not, but I'll stop pacing. Maybe.
Okay. Okay, there you go. Okay, so start that over, I guess, and we'll cut this out.
Okay.
Start with the part where you say you want to go back to something significant Melissa said.
No, that came through loud and clear. Okay.
Again, there's a canon law doctrine of subsidiarity. And that means bottom up, which is not how the Vatican normally works. But to expect the Pope to take a position for 2 billion Catholics living in all kinds of different sanitary conditions, the Pope can't do a one-size-fits-all policy, and just like no child with vaccines is one-size-fits-all. So what they should do is deputize the local priests to support their local families on the parish level. That's what all of the churches should do. All of the churches, because if you're living in the developed world in a hygienic environment, then you have a different vaccine profile than if you're living in a slum and don't have clean water and don't have.
And that's so toilets. People don't realize that's an important thing to understand.
Right.
That you cannot have the same vaccine schedule for those two conditions that you're talking about.
Right.
You should not. I should say you should not have the same vaccine schedule for the person who's living in the developed nation with access to good nutrition, good hygiene, and medical care as the person who's living in a developing nation. You can't give the same amount to everybody, or you shouldn't need to. It's unnecessary, and they should be really customizing this based on where you live and the circumstances that you live.
But I like what you're saying. This should be on the local level and among the religious organizations. Yeah.
That's what we should be asking the religious leaders to do, is deputize the people at the local level. So back to your question on I drew up on firstfreedoms.org like a 10 theses, like 10 very basic valid religious reasons why someone might object to a vaccination.
Yeah, I've read through that. Yeah, it almost looks like an old proclamation, like from the Middle Ages, the way you kind of designed it, which I like. I like the look. Yeah.
Yeah, we were going Martin Luther, like Martin Luther's 95 Theses.
Yeah.
That was that protest movement worked. But nobody should nail this to their church door. You bring a hammer to your church, you might get lead to a 911 call. Bad plan.
It's looked down upon these days.
But here's a top 10, and you can stop me at any time if you want to dive in, or we can wait till the end. But that production of some vaccines involve use of aborted fetal cells. Like that right there can be enough. You don't need any more rationale to have a religious exemption. The vaccine manufacturing production involves the use of materials from other species, cows, pigs, chickens, monkeys, creating the potential for contamination with the DNA of other species. That's obviously not kosher. The sixth commandment prohibits the "thou shalt not kill." Vaccines can kill. I mean, these aren't complicated concepts of why someone might have a religious objection. The fifth commandment, this is one of my favorite arguments, is of honor thy mother and father. I think that gets misinterpreted as meaning your own parents. I think that this is a commandment that society should honor mothers and fathers. Thou shalt not kill doesn't mean don't kill your own family. It means don't kill anybody. Honor thy mother and father. Why isn't that for the entire society? Why doesn't that apply to the school nurse? So I think that's another one. And then we can run wild with the ninth commandment of bearing false witness. Because, how many different ways does vaccine promotion bear false witness? The biggest whopper, the biggest whopper is they have liability protection because they're legally classified as unavoidably unsafe, and then they're marketed as safe and effective. That is false witness. That's not telling the truth. That's why can't your religious leader support you on that ground? But again, it goes on and on and on.
Right, and I guess let me jump in on the first one, because I've always felt like that was by far probably the primary basis that anyone would have a religious reason to opt out of vaccines, and I want to maybe expand on that some, because it's very important. So basically, it's the fact that they use cells from fetuses from terminated pregnancies to make some of our vaccines. And the specifics on that are basically the MMR vaccine, chickenpox vaccine, hepatitis A vaccines, and then some of our large combinations that include the polio vaccine, such as Pentacell and Quadracell, where they give you several all in one syringe. It's the polio component of those vaccines that have these fetal cells in them. Ironically, the plain polio shot we use does not have human fetal cells. It's only in the large combinations. So where these fetal tissues come from, it's basically they terminated pregnancies many years ago. And Kevin, when I'm done with this, maybe you can talk about Dr. Plotkin if you want, and some of his recent statements. But basically, they terminated pregnancies, and they researched fetal tissue and discovered two types of cells are amazing when it comes to being able to nourish germs and grow germs in the laboratory and keep these germs alive in huge batches so that we can then put the germs into the vaccines. And the two types of cells, they're called MRC5 and WI38. And those are the two different cell lines. So the way you will know if a certain vaccine has fetal cells in it is you'll see those terms, MRC5, WI38. You'll see those in the description of the vaccine on the FDA package insert. Okay, so we have these fetal cells that came from fetuses, many decades ago, and they used to put on the MMR vaccine package insert that there is actually DNA fragments from these fetal cells in the final vaccine solution. It actually used to be listed as an ingredient. They took it off a few years ago because I think it was scaring too many people. But we know from independent research that these 4 vaccines I already mentioned have these fetal tissues, fetal DNA from a terminated pregnancy from a long time ago. And then finally, they took the rubella virus to make today's vaccine. They extracted that rubella virus from a terminated pregnancy many decades ago, and that's the rubella virus they've been nourishing all these years to put in today's vaccines. And I think a number of religions oppose terminating pregnancies, and I think anyone who has that religious basis, to me, that's kind of the primary reason why someone would be able to opt out of these vaccines. So I just wanted to go through that because a lot of people don't understand that there is actual fetal DNA in these actual vaccines and where that comes from. A lot of people don't believe it. Well, now you know, and now you can show people the package insert to demonstrate the source of these. So thank you for letting me kind of digress into that a little bit, but I think that's very important to understand.
No, I wasn't digressing at all. That's the heart of the matter.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
And as you said, Dr. Plotkin, who's like he's a developer of the rubella vaccine. He was deposed in January 2018, and there's 9 hours of deposition. If you can search for it online. FirstFreedoms.org has a YouTube channel. It's not much on there, but there's 4 clips of Dr. Plotkin, and Dr. Plotkin talks about having used 76 fetuses in developing one of the vaccines. He also talks that he does not think anyone can have a valid religious objection to vaccination. And then right after that, he admits that he's an atheist. So I'm not sure. State legislators.
Yeah, I saw that. I actually saw that when I was reading the deposition, which I found that to be really interesting because actually I heard the same about Paul Offit, that he had said the same, but which I just thought was a total coincidence. I just think it's really funny that people can be so adamantly promoting taking away rights, allowing for a certain portion of the population to be harmed, for the greater good. That can literally be what their life's goal is in their career. To me, it makes sense that you could do something like that and ignore everything else that you're seeing, only in a circumstance where you maybe didn't believe in something higher, because there has to be a level of moral conscience and a certain level of consciousness that you have for protecting other people, caring for other people, being upset that other people are being hurt. To be able to just disconnect like that and just, I don't know what's going on, this is science, like to have that kind of disconnect where you are forgetting that human lives and families are being affected every single day by this, to me can only really exist if you do not believe that there is something that has, created us all or is connecting us all or whatever kind of spirituality that you have. Everything leads to a nature of love and connectedness. And without that, it seems pretty easy that you could go on and spend decades essentially lying to people about something for profit.
Yeah, and something I just found very concerning is yesterday I read 2 medical articles about religious exemptions and two articles just published in the last year where they really break down the medical opinion about religious exemptions to vaccination. Mm-hmm. And they pretty much disregard religion or the value of religion. And they almost feel like, and I think a lot of science is going in this direction. Religion just doesn't matter enough to trump scientific beliefs, mm-hmm. and that science is more important, and so they don't see any value in respecting anyone's religious beliefs, and that's a very, very scary precedent. If our society is going to go in that direction, to me that's very scary.
Yeah.
Well, I support
Go ahead, Kevin.
Dr. Plotkin's. I'm sorry. I support Dr. Plotkin's atheist views, but the whole point of the First Amendment is you don't get to impose your views on other people.
Mm-hmm.
So, like Dr. Plotkin can have his religious view, I have mine, Melissa has hers, you have yours, and that's the idea of the First Amendment. Is that the founders of this country came here to be more religious. Right? They were being persecuted in Europe for being extra religious. So they decided to come here, and that was one of the first rules they set up, is you can't impose your belief on someone else. And the Dr. Plotkins of the world, through vaccine mandates, are imposing their beliefs on others.
That's true.
That's what they're doing.
Right. Yeah, or their belief that your religion is not valid enough, or your belief system is not valid enough.
Right, especially if they're atheists, they would say, yeah, your complete belief system has no foundation. It's not built on anything. It's built on a lie and a falsehood, so we can completely disregard it in the name of science.
But isn't that because they kind of make science their religion?
Right, like as Kevin said.
It's exactly. As if science is the religion, and therefore everything else is wrong, which, of course... ironically enough, so much science has proven a connection to something else. There's like quantum physics that's actually measuring, levels of something other than just us. That's actually scientifically, documented now. Like, so it's kind of ironic that these dogmatic people, but Plotkin, he's older. And so he's really, really firmly rooted in this idea that there is no religious need to like you're saying, trump what could be considered a public health crisis. And because they think anybody who's not fully vaccinated is not vaccinating, that makes everybody a public health threat. Then that means that no religion, nothing you could say would ever be good enough to stop that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and building on that, like if you go to the 10 Theses page on the First Freedom's website, you'll see the picture, and I'm not making this up. I wish I could have invented this, but it's the Temple of Vaccinia, the hut where Edward Jenner gave cowpox to the little boy. In England, this is the British Medical Journal. They call it the Temple of Vaccinia. So I've been calling their religion Vaccinians. So Plotkin is certainly a senior member of the Vaccinian faith, and the Vaccinians should not be able to impose their beliefs on it. And one thing we were talking about before, when we were talking about both false witness, and I think the way we need to rephrase that 47 states have religious exemptions, it's not just 47 states, it's 47 states and the American Medical Association.
Right,
the American Medical Association, their code of ethics, they have religious and philosophical exemptions for their members. And they have a policy statement since 2015 that they're looking to remove them from everyone else. Right, the height of hypocrisy.
Yeah, if you go to firstfreedoms.org, you'll see that article. I just saw you posted that the other day. I do find that ironic that the AMA, they support vaccination and they recommend that their doctors get vaccinated. But you're right, they do have a clause in there that says, except in the event of a legitimate religious or personal objection. And you're right. Why do they allow that for their members when they do have a policy that they announced several years ago that it is now one of their policies to try to eliminate personal and religious exemptions nationwide? You're right. It's I don't know, you call it, bearing false witness. I mean, it is kind of what's the word I'm looking for, Melissa? You're my word person.
A lie.
Okay.
Is that the word you were looking for?
It's like a double standard, so to speak.
Hypocrisy.
Yeah.
Well, I found this study that was actually, it's in the Croatian Medical Journal. It was in 2016.
I saw that too. That was one of the ones I saw. Yeah.
So it's called Religious Exemption for Vaccination or Religious Exemptions for Avoiding Vaccination. And it breaks down the main religions. So it talks about Catholicism, Protestant view, Islamic view, Buddhist view, Japanese view. And it goes through each of them to say whether or not there is, quote unquote, a valid reason that you would want to object to vaccines. And I just want to quote a few things from this because it has to do with what we're talking about here. like Kevin mentioned, for the Catholicism overview, they talk a lot about the aborted fetal cells. And it mentions the vaccines, like you mentioned, Dr. Bob, that include that. And it said basically there would only be permitted in the case of extrema ratio. In this case, extreme situations as saving the lives of children, right? So they're saying you should not partake in any of these things that come from aborted fetal cells unless there's an extreme ratio. And so what they're suggesting is it's an extreme ratio to be vaccinated for disease. Like they have concluded that that's what they were referring to, and that falls under that umbrella for them.
Like the current state of affairs means it's so extremely dangerous to not vaccinate that they're saying that's not a religious,
because they're saying it's saving the lives of children. And I do sort of understand, Kevin alluded to this before, there are a lot of places where Catholicism is the main religion, and it's a poor country with, they don't have good access to medical care or different things like that. And so it is really hard for them to make a blanket statement across the board of what all Catholics should feel, because it does depend on where you are. But so it says Catholicism should, this is what they're telling you. The study, authors of the study are telling you, Catholicism should emphasize the importance of taking the risk of side effects of vaccination to strengthen solidarity with other humans. Meaning you should just go ahead and accept the risk of side effects just to become more connected to others, I guess in your religion, even though they don't really advocate for religions here. By taking this risk, you're protecting people. And it says you're also protecting the vaccinated that did not get immunogenic response. So what they're saying is you should take the risk to protect the people for whom the vaccine failed, which I think is just ironic.
Right. And again, what I didn't like about this article is they scientifically pretty much denounce all these valid religious reasons.
They do. And this is the quote that I really was just turned off by. It says, where children are concerned, it is irresponsible to ignore the almost universal weight of medical opinion. They're saying it is universal. Medical opinion is so strong and so accurate, according to them, that it is there's a universal weight to that viewpoint being more valuable than any other viewpoint, whether it's your particular pastor or religious leader or yourself, you and your family. Like they're saying that the medical opinion has a universal weight. I think that's concerning because there's such a difference between doctors, right? One doctor tells you one thing, one doctor tells you something else. That variation is so strong that there cannot be a universal weight to medical opinion, just like there can't be a universal approach to medical treatment. And the last thing I want to mention from this study is that they said, and this is where I think it becomes political, like, Kevin was mentioning. It's hard not to include the political part of this because it says society in the 21st century uses religion as an excuse for wars, discrimination, and now for vaccination refusal. They're literally lumping in opting out of vaccines or a dose or two or whatever. That is the equivalent to them with discrimination and war. Which is, we're talking about two very, very strong things that have, followed through history. And war, how do you put the two together? They're basically saying so somebody who is going to opt out is the same as somebody who is, killing somebody in a war. Like they're basically putting those two and two together when, and what they're doing by that is they're trying to shape the way you feel about it.
Right.
Somebody who opts out, like, oh my God, they're one of them. It becomes, how do you put together somebody who has a religious exemption with the idea of war and discrimination? The irony there is that the discrimination is happening on our end, the people that are choosing to opt out. But when I read that, I couldn't believe they're trying to really convince you that the public health crisis, it says religious freedom is a threat to public health. This is what it says. And the fact that they compared it to war, I couldn't believe it.
Right. So and
this is a study, right?
So I think those of you who are in the religious community really need to take these kinds of issues to your leaders and say, wake up. This isn't just going to happen on vaccines. This could happen in all areas of medicine and science. Science is really taking this bold step, trying to denounce this based on the vaccine issue because it's safe, and they're probably going to try. Maybe they'll get away with it. We need to stand up religiously as a nation now against this. Kevin, what are your thoughts on that?
I agree, and that's the whole point of where I tried to draw out the 10 theses is to spark a conversation, bring it to your religious leader, leave some behind in your church, your synagogue, your mosque, and to start that conversation. Because if not only if you lose your ability to opt out now, are you accepting the current vaccine schedule? You're accepting the future vaccine schedule.
Right.
When you lose your ability to opt out, there's 270 vaccines under development. So, when they add 100 more, and your grandkids in 20 years, instead of getting 72 vaccines, have 200 vaccines before kindergarten, and you have no ability to opt out, what happened? It's so mind-boggling to me that people are sitting by quietly, and the religious leaders are sitting by quietly and letting their First Amendment right go by the wayside because they're afraid to be labeled anti-vax.
I know.
They're afraid to be labeled anti-vax. That's what it comes down to.
You're right. You're absolutely right.
And I also think and Bob and I have talked about this before, over drinks maybe 5 years ago. But I've never viewed this as science versus belief, right? That's what the medical community wants you to think, mm-hmm. right? That if you either have a religious belief or a scientific fact, right? Science isn't math. Science doesn't have a definitive answer. Science is evolving. Science is always getting better, right? So that I think it's a belief versus a belief when you're and Bob's been very eloquent about measles even from way back. I remember one line you had. I think was great that your chances of getting measles in the wild is as close to it's not zero, but it's as close to zero as you can get without being zero,
right.
Or something like that.
Right.
And also that your risk of an adverse event is, from MMR is not very large, right? But either way, there's a leap of faith at the end at the vaccine choice. If you choose to get it, you're making a leap of faith that you won't have a serious adverse event. If you choose not to get it, you're making a leap of faith that you're not going to encounter it in the wild and have a bad result. So to me, it's a faith question. At the end of the day, you're making a leap of faith no matter what your choice is.
Yes.
It's not one is science and one is faith. It's faith versus faith.
Right. And I want to bring up something that kind of Melissa touched on earlier that really concerns me, specifically the Amish people. Or one of you talked about, people came to this country for religious freedom. The Puritans Quakers, the Amish. I mean, large groups of people looking for religious freedom. And we know the Amish have been in the news a lot lately with some of these vaccine outbreaks. And as a community, they're choosing to opt out of vaccines, and it's really a part of their religiously held beliefs. Now in America, 300 years after all these people came over to get this freedom, to escape from English tyranny, and have this religious freedom, now we are being tyrannical on those groups of people, again, all in the name of science. And if that doesn't concern all Americans, then I don't even know what to say. I mean, that should concern everybody, that this religious freedom is being taken away from these specific religious groups. Not only them, but all of us.
You're saying they came here to avoid religious persecution in the first place. Right.
And how many of us read in the history books, we thought how awful it was, how persecuted they were, across the pond, and how we loved how they came over here for freedom and to get away from all the persecution, and they wanted to exercise religious freedom, and that's why that's the first part of the First Amendment, and that is now under threat, and it just. Again, it's just, to me, it's mind-boggling.
But my thing is, how do we decide who thinks it is valid or not valid? Like, who gets to decide?
Right. Nobody should get to decide that.
Right. Like, so you've got, who picks this board of people to be the ones to say whether your religious objection is valid or not? Because at some point, it's opinion. It's coming down to somebody's opinion of what your belief system is, and whether or not there is a public health crisis based on your decision to opt out.
Well, I'll tell you who decides that. And Kevin, I want you to speak on this. It's the state legislators. get to decide that because this is not a federal issue. This is a state issue. And one by one, state legislatures are now deciding whether or not people should have this religious freedom. But
how can you put such a big thing into the hands of one or two people or three people or four people that are pushing something? How do they get to be the ones that say, yeah, yours is cool, no, yours is not, or this is enough, or this is not enough, or this isn't real, or you know what I mean? Like, it just seems ridiculous.
I agree, it shouldn't be that way, but that's the nature of our democratic societies. Okay, Kevin, why don't you talk us maybe through some of the politics of this and how it relates to these religious issues?
Yeah, thanks. And that is what we're coming down to is what happened in California in 2015. It was a party line vote. The Democratic Party passed it through. The Democratic Party had 2/3 majorities in both the Assembly and the Senate in California, and they had a Democratic governor. And thousands and thousands and thousands of parents went to Sacramento, including both of you. And the constituents were ignored, and the party just passed it and moved on. And that's what's happening all around the country now. In states that in 2018, where the blue wave hit a lot of blue states, and now there are Democratic majorities in the and I'm happy to be a Democrat, by the way, but there's Democratic majorities in the Assembly, the House, and the Senate in New York, in New Jersey, in Connecticut, in Maine, in Oregon, in Washington, and it's a danger zone where if these exemption bills go through just on a party line vote, the Democratic Party could take them away from all of the citizens of those states. And generally, the Republican Party is better on this issue from like a personal liberty standpoint.
You would think.
They're generally better.
You're saying historically,
historically and recently. I went to in 2016. I went to both the Republican National Convention and the Democratic National Convention as an issue advocate, and that was the question I was asking was. If the state and the parent disagree on how to vaccinate, who prevails, the parent or the state? And I got about 75% at the RNC were saying the parent, and 100% at the DNC were saying the state. So what I had with me, I had a bunch of things as printouts with me, but one from my UN experience is the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights.
Right.
So, we've both seen that, yeah.
We've both seen that, and that fits the AMA ethical standard fits it. But let me just read quickly from it, because I was showing this to the Democratic delegates, and I said, that's against the bioethics and human rights standards, and they were reading it and said, oh, no, I didn't know that. I was like, does this change your mind? And the answer was no. And that's frightening.
Because it can't, right? It can't change their mind. They're not allowed for that to change their mind.
They're kind of locked in. They're locked into the position that that the state knows better than the parent. It's ridiculous.
I know.
Right?
So, what is that? What is that statement?
So here it is. It's clear as day. Article 3 of the Universal Declaration of Bioethics and Human Rights. The interests and welfare of the individual should have priority over the sole interest of science or society. Clear as day.
Yeah,
the individual takes priority over science or society. And then under consent, Article 6, any preventative medical intervention is only to be carried out with the prior free and informed consent of the person concerned based on adequate information. The consent should, where appropriate, be expressed and may be withdrawn by the person concerned at any time and for any reason without disadvantage or prejudice. Clear as day.
Exactly.
It's clear as day. And this again is what I think is maybe the most damning bearing false witness is never mentioned, never, right? It's always your duty to the bubble boy, right? Every news article is what's your duty to the immunocompromised, right?
Every time, yeah.
And every time, and it's not that your ethical standard, and these ethical standards didn't come out of nowhere. They came out of Nazi atrocities. They came out of Tuskegee. They came out of all kinds of bad things that happened when the state had control over the individual, and the state told the individual what to do. Right?
Well, I think that's the big risk is that if it's not just vaccines, what other medical procedures? We've talked about that. What other medical treatments would they be okay? Because the state knows better than you. And like you're saying, 100% of the Democrats agreed with the state having more knowledge about your child than you are, or being willing to make decisions about your child. I mean, that is frightening. And I don't know. I don't know what the future looks like with that kind of mindset, but.
Well, in 1927, a case that followed on the same of Jacobson on forced vaccination, to where vaccination could be mandated, were the forced sterilization cases.
Right.
And it was a 8-1 decision in favor of the state can force sterilization on you.
Wow. Yes.
Buck versus Bell.
Yeah.
And, so like this idea, this kind of eugenic idea that the state knows better than the individual, it's out there, right? And this is I don't want to go into too crazy of a topic, but after World War II, eugenics, went away as a science, had a lot of bad press. So it got rebranded, and the Society of Human Genetics was founded in 1949. So eugenics never went away; it just rebranded itself as genetics. So, like that, there are people who think that they know better than the individual. That's out there. I would call that the Vaccinian faith.
Right.
Well, especially when you look at medical history and the need to understand medical history and your family history. How could you possibly know more without the information that parents have? Like, that's ridiculous.
Yeah. So this is
So let me get back to what we need in state houses for a second, because what we need are democratic. We need democratic elected officials to understand that, as you were saying earlier, Bob, that there has to be a compelling interest. What's the high interest to take away a first freedom of the religious freedom? And it's a public relations campaign regarding measles, a relatively benign disease, should not be enough to take away a First Amendment freedom.
Right.
Exactly. Yes.
And who decides? This is where I think we can get the Democratic people to join us. The question isn't what's in the syringe, mostly for me. It's who decides what to do, the parents or the state. And that's a very fundamental question. And I think it's such an important fundamental American thing in the First Amendment that I would hope elected officials of both parties could stand up for that principle against vaccine mandates, which also happen to be against bioethics, human rights, and many, many, many valid religious reasons to say no.
Yes,
and just another reason why this is not a black and white debate, and why there are so many layers, and this is so complex, and it's so individual. Like, every person has a different reason for why they come to their belief system, and it needs to be customizable. It cannot be universal mass vaccination on a full schedule for everyone. It just cannot. There are too many factors here, including, in this case, religious beliefs, and that's something nobody gets to decide whether that's valid or not, or they shouldn't get to decide.
Yeah. So we're in scary times. Because this particular topic, it's all about religion, and that's kind of one of the most sacred freedoms that we in America have. So, Kevin, I appreciate the work you do in New York and nationwide, and so it was a nice little educational process for me to really look at this from a religious standpoint instead of a medical one. And again, I appreciate what you're doing at, again, it's firstfreedoms.org. I know you have some articles there. You post on Facebook. Is that correct? And is that how you want people to follow you on Facebook and on your website?
Yes, that would be best. And let me just throw one other thing out there. Thomas Jefferson wrote his own tombstone. And he listed 3 accomplishments on it. 1 was author of the Declaration of Independence. 2 was the author of the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom. And 3 was the father of the University of Virginia. So, I mean, that guy puts as his second accomplishment the Statute of Religious Freedom, which is the basis of the First Amendment. Yeah. He leaves off 2-term president. He leaves off vice president. Secretary of State. That doesn't matter. And he's right. That is what's important. That's the legacy. Thomas Jefferson's legacy is freedom of religion. Don't give that up to a measles scare. It's hype. It's just a scare. Right. And legislators It boggles my mind that legislators can't see this. And one quick last story: I was testifying in Connecticut last week, and I had a nice talk with a lot of legislators and met them in the hall afterwards. And I was just very quietly saying, like, if you notice, all the outbreak hypes are in states with bills, and they're like, "Oh no, that can't be." I was like, okay, can you please come over here for a second? It's like they're talking about Seattle, they're talking about Oregon, Washington. There's 2 measles cases in New Haven, and I'm like, there were 2 measles cases in New Haven last year, and 2 the year before, and 2 the year before, but you didn't hear about them because they weren't trying to take away 3.5 million people's freedom. You heard about it now because they're coming for you.
Yeah, and these bills were waiting. They were essentially written and waiting.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is very concerning, but hopefully people will get this word out there and reach their legislators. And
it is important to understand how the politics does go in line with the religious views. For some people that might say, oh, I'm not that religious. That's not the point. Right. The point is that it is a protected freedom, and it is tied into what legislators are trying to control. And so those two really are hand in hand. You can't really talk about religious freedoms without talking about the politics as it relates to this. So for everybody that is concerned with vaccine choice, you also need to be concerned with religious freedoms being taken away because it's part of the equation.
Yeah. So
reach out to your legislators and hopefully bring your religious leaders with you.
Yes. Yeah. Well, thanks, Kevin. We appreciate you taking the time to go through this with us, and I'm sure we'll see you around. I know we're friends and colleagues, and it was good to be able to chat with you today.
Likewise, and this is a great podcast. I listen to everyone.
You're hooked, right, Kevin?
Because you just find me so fascinating, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm your super fan.
Thanks for joining us.
No, Kevin, that was your cue to say something nice about Melissa, but
I know.
Oh
gosh.
I missed my cue.
Oh, Kevin. All right, well, take care. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to all of our listeners for joining us for the Vaccine Conversation with Melissa and Dr. Bob. We will be back soon with some new exciting episodes, continuing to bring to you all the different facets of this debate. And if you want to weigh in on what you'd like us to talk about, make sure to rate and review us on iTunes or go to our IEG, our Immunity Education Group Facebook page. Check out our website, immunityeducationgroup.com.
.org.
.org and .com.
And sign up for our email list. We're now going to be putting out some an occasional, maybe a monthly. I
didn't want to say it this time too because you just said it last time. So I was trying to sprinkle it in.
I know, but sign up for our email list, and we promise we'll send you fascinating stuff, all maybe with Melissa's picture on it.
Oh yeah.
And
AK junk mail.
So anyway, but so sign up on the email list because that's we're gonna start reaching out to people that way as well to help spread the word, because this is a very important word that people need to hear. So anyway, thanks you guys. We'll see you next time.
Thanks again.
The information in this podcast is for entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as medical advice. Always consult your healthcare professional for information on vaccines and infectious diseases.